You're starting your journey into reading Lord of the Rings, starting with Fellowship of the Ring. Little nerd confession here. I remember when I first read Lord of the Rings, I was in middle school. I did it over a very long weekend, barely coming up for breath. I remember roughly 2/3 of the way through, stepping outside to catch a little bit of breath, see some sun, feel the fresh breeze on my face, and then I dived in for more. So I remember getting very little sleep. It was an exciting time. Loved the story, and I hope you love it as well. It may help your reading as you go through Lord of the Rings to know a little bit more about the man and some of the things that motivated him, his time and environments. Look at his love of language, country, and Christ. And when I say country, I mean not only England, but also the countryside, and how that plays out in the books. It may also help you to understand not only those times and those influences and how that comes in, but a number of themes come through the books as well. We'll see themes about loyalty. We'll also see how his ethos or morality plays out in the books. So there are a number of themes that it'll be good to be on the lookout for as you go through that may again help your reading. This is an epic tale. It is a tale with multiple countries, multiple peoples. It spans a long period of time. It is the quintessential epic. And Tolkien is, in fact, the father of high fantasy that has that big, epic, sweeping tale to it. But it's also an intimate story, a story about the hobbits, and especially about Sam and Frodo and their love and loyalty for one another, and how that impacts the story as well. So, big sweeping tale, intimate connections. We'll see those again and again throughout the story. So I'll give you some places, I won't give any spoilers away, where you can start to look for some of these themes, especially in Fellowship. They play throughout the whole series, but you will see them in microcosm in Fellowship of the Ring as well. I hope this helps your reading.
Now let's take an opportunity to look at those different themes: the man, the theologian, the storyteller. And let's look at how they will affect his writing in Lord of the Rings. Well, first we got to just check out the guy's name. John Ronald Reuel Tolkien. If that doesn't say old school, I don't know what does. He was born at the end of the Victorian era, 1892, came of age during the Edwardian era, and served in the Great War, lived through World War II, and saw man land on the moon. He died in 1973, so he saw a tremendous amount of change during his lifetime. Part of that loss of the good things of the past and enjoyment of good things of the future play out in his writing. Take a look at where you see him handling change, themes of change within Lord of the Rings. It's not all bad, it's not all good, as is true in all of life. He was a scholar. He taught at Oxford, had friends among the Inklings, which were other scholars at Oxford, by and large, and was a philologist. That means he's a lover of language. These days we like to use the word linguist, but I like the old term a little bit better. His love of language came out incredibly clearly in both his motivation for Lord of the Rings. But getting back to the man, and we'll come back to the philologist in just a moment, he mostly lived outside of large urban areas for most of his life. He did lament the effect of the industrial age on the countryside, so he hated to see the loss of trees and much of the countryside being taken up through urbanization. So look again for themes related to that as you read Fellowship. Coming back to this lover of language, Tolkien himself said that part of his motivation to write Lord of the Rings was to create a world and backstory for the Elven languages. He invented Elvish languages first. Tolkien, in fact, called inventing private languages his secret vice. As you read Fellowship, look for the importance of names, words, and language. It's strewn throughout the entire book. Look also for the tie between culture and place or location and language. See how the language is rooted in the land, is rooted in the people, and how they affect one another. For example, you can look for elements of the Viking culture, especially amongst the Rohirrim. He was a hater of war. He served in one of the hottest battles of World War I including the Battle of Somme as a signals officer. He lost all but one of his closest friends by 1918. He in fact suffered trench fever through lice, and it probably saved his life because after he was in hospital, most of his unit was lost. During his time as a soldier, he gained sympathy for the everyday soldier being thrown together with them in the war. So he learned to love and respect the Tommy, the everyday soldier, as an officer in the Army. One of the things to look for too is he had a notion or saw an understanding of the relationship between those who serve and the officer and their close bond. There was a informal position known as Batman. That was essentially a kind of butler-like position, valet position within the Army for officers. And look for a character that plays that sort of role to another. He was also a Christian, and in fact a Catholic Christian, in a time where Catholicism was disparaged among the English. That played a role in his overall thinking and in his defense of Christianity. His mother, in fact, had to move at one point because she was Catholic. So look for ways in which different cultures manage to look at disparate views and how they handled that. Diving a little bit more into his Christianity, Christianity informs and influences his writing, but it doesn't do so in a super obvious way, say like in Narnia for C.S. Lewis. Much like Galadriel's line from the first movie, normally I'll simply quote the book, but this is so good I can't resist. In describing how she knows the world is changing, she says, "I feel it in the water, I feel it in the earth, I smell it in the air." So too we see Tolkien's Christianity in the very weave and weft of the fabric of Middle-earth. It plays in its overall angelic structure. You don't get a complete sense of that in Lord of the Rings. You get hints of it. It's much stronger in the Silmarillion, which is essentially an almost textbook of history compared to this novel of Middle-earth. There you'll see a creation story. Eru Ilúvatar and his angels create the world. You'll see a notion of a fallen angel that introduces sin into the world. It is a world based on God's creation. And you'll also see a heavenly hierarchy. That plays a little bit closer towards Tolkien's Catholicism as opposed to mere Christianity. He is not a fan of allegory, and allegory doesn't play a role here. If you read his foreword to Fellowship, you'll see very clearly that he defends that this is not allegorical. He is not, for example, trying to show an allegory about World War II in this book. It started much before World War II was even on the table. And he doesn't embed allegorical notions of Christianity into the novel. But you will see places, for example, a notion of eucatastrophe. Now, in an essay called Fairy Tales, Tolkien argues that fairy tales contain eucatastric elements because they essentially point to our inward knowing of God and his sacrifice that he makes for us, because eucatastrophe is that moment of turning when everything looks bleak, fallen, and black, and everything is changed for the better. So in our history, the eucatastric event, of course, is Jesus' death and resurrection. But you will see sort of many versions of apparent deaths and resurrections of people or places or battles or whatever within Lord of the Rings. And so you'll see many eucatastric events come up. So look for those as you read them. One of them is pretty clear and is in Fellowship. But look, have an eye out for eucatastrophe embedded in Lord of the Rings. We also see his Christianity in the sense of grace or providence that is given. The Fellowship are unable in themselves to complete their tasks. And so there are various times where it seems like providence intervenes to help save the day. So look for times where it appears that grace or providence steps in and makes a difference in what happens. Also look for it in the way that the ethos of Middle-earth, the ethics, the moral structure holds together. It's a very Judeo-Christian notion of good, right, and wrong. You'll see it played out especially in Sam and all the hobbits in terms of their love and loyalty. The notion that we are united in Christ, loyal to one another, that we will, as the song indicates, show we are Christians by our love, really is borne out by the love that the hobbits have for one another, and especially Sam for Frodo. And so look for that, and look for sacrifice. They make sacrifices for one another. They make sacrifices for their mission and duty, and you'll see that played out again and again and again. We'll also see it a little bit in how we understand magic. Magic is a lot less about spells, although obviously the wizards do those, and more about the embedded power from Eru Ilúvatar. There is a particularly brilliant quote from Sam that kind of indicates this. Whether they've, meaning the elves, made the land or the land's made them, it's hard to say, if you take my meaning. It's wonderfully quiet here. Nothing seems to be going on, and nobody seems to want it to. If there's any magic about, it's right down deep, where I can't lay my hands on it. In a manner of speaking, Frodo replies, you can see it and feel it everywhere. Now you can see where Galadriel got her quote. But that's really a good picture of how magic plays a role in Lord of the Rings, and how it's almost like in the real world a similar role that the person and work of the Holy Spirit plays in our lives. It's a providential role, it's a behind the scenes role, it's an enabling role. It's not something that you conjure up, but rather a gift that is given. And finally, let's look at Tolkien the storyteller. He is the father of modern high fantasy. The elements of being this sweeping tale come into play. He is a world and language creator, so creating all of Middle-earth and the whole structure of cultures and peoples and languages around that was really the impetus towards high fantasy. One of the really interesting things about this epic tale, however, is that it also combines an intimate tale. So you see a large sweeping story where we'll have large scale areas moving across all of Middle-earth. You'll see large armies and big battles and many different peoples come into play, while at the same time there's a continual theme and focus of the hobbits and their relationship, and in particular Frodo and Sam. So even as the story starts out, look for how it expands from Hobbiton to larger Shire, to outside Shire, to the big world, to the bigger issues of the day. So keep in mind as you read, looking for the epic tale and that intimate story that's woven throughout. Also look for other ways that he plays out his storytelling life in terms of dealing with compelling issues of the day. Again, you'll see throughout the book that there is no true neutrality that can be maintained. You must take a side. See where that comes into the story. It does so in many different places. As I mentioned in talking about his Christian morals, they are embedded in Lord of the Rings, but he doesn't write Lord of the Rings to make a moral point. He's much more about story and much less about making a point, although he makes a number of points along the way. He doesn't craft the story to make the point. He makes points through a crafted story based on who he is and his character. So this is where you see knowing the author really helping out, because he doesn't write it on a sleeve of the story. We see it played out again and again throughout the book as it's woven into the story, as opposed to, I'm going to make a moral point now. I hope that helps you look at different elements of Lord of the Rings, and especially of Tolkien, as you read the story, areas to look out for that may help you understand it just a little bit better, or make it a little bit easier to follow it. Thanks.